Brought to you by Penguin.
Noonday by Pat Barker. Read by Juliet Stevenson, Stephen Boxer, John Sackville, Anne Reid, and Finlay Robertson. 1. Eleanor was halfway up the drive when she sensed she was being watched. She stopped and scanned the upstairs windows, wide open in the heat, as if the house were gasping for breath. But there was nobody looking down. Then, from the sycamore tree at the end of the garden, came a rustling of leaves. Oh, of course, Kenny. She was tempted to ignore him, but that seemed unkind, so she went across the lawn and peered up into the branches. "Kenny?" No reply. There was often no reply. Kenny had arrived almost a year ago now, among the first batch of evacuees, and although this area had since been reclassified, neutral rather than safe, here he remained. She felt his gaze heavy on the top of her head, like a hand, as she stood squinting up into the late afternoon sunlight. Kenny spent hours up there, not reading his comics, not building a treehouse, not dropping conkers on people's heads. No, just watching. He had a red notebook in which he wrote 2. Closing the front door quietly behind her, Eleanor took a moment to absorb the silence. Facing her, directly opposite the front door, where nobody could possibly miss it, was a portrait of her brother, Toby, in uniform. It had been painted from photographs several years after his death, and was frankly not very good. Everybody else seemed to like it, or at least tolerate it, but Eleanor thought it was a complete travesty. Item, 1 standard issue gallant young officer, Grim Reaper for the use of. There was nothing of Toby there at all. Nigel Featherstone was the artist, and he was very well regarded. You saw his portraits of judges, masters of colleges, politicians and generals everywhere, but she'd never liked his work. Her own portrait of Toby was stronger. Not good, she didn't claim that, but certainly better than this. She resented not having been asked to paint this family portrait. His own sister, after all. And every visit to her sister's house began with her standing in front of it. When he was alive, Toby's presence had been the only thing that made weekends with the rest of her family bearable. Now this portrait, that blank, lifeless face, was a reminder that she was going to have to face them alone. She caught the creak of a leather armchair from the open door on her left. Oh, well, better get it over with. She went into the room and found Tim, her brother-in-law, sitting by the open window. As soon as he saw her, he stood up and let his newspaper slide, sighing, to the floor. "Eleanor," he pecked her proffered cheek. "Too early for a whiskey?" Evidently it wasn't. There was a half-empty glass by his side. She opened her mouth to refuse, but he'd already started to pour. "How was the train?" "Crowded. Late." "Aren't they all?" When she'd first met Tim, he might have been a neutered tomcat for all the interest he aroused in her. She'd thought him a nonentity, perhaps influenced in that, as in so much else, by Toby, who hadn't liked Tim, or perhaps hadn't found much in him to either like or dislike. And yet Tim had gone on to be a successful man, powerful even. Something in Whitehall, in the War Office, which was strange because he'd never actually seen active service. It had never been clear to her what precisely Tim did, though when she expressed her bewilderment to Paul, he laughed and said, "Do you really not know?" She took a sip of whiskey. "I saw some soldiers in the lane." "Yes, they're building gun emplacements on the river." "Just over there?" He shrugged. "It's the obvious place." How easily they'd all come to accept it. Searchlights over the church at night, blacked-out houses, the never-ending pop-pop of guns on the marshes. Such an inconsequential sound, almost...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?